Hello everybody. Okay, today I am painting for you. Subject is going to be an urban scene, as you can probably already tell by the photo I've got here. Sorry. But the real topic for today I wanted to cover was just your intention, rather than just copying an image of what you see, either when painting from real life or from a photo. What is it you're trying to tell in your photo, in your painting, your potential painting? Once you have a direction for your intention, then every other decision you're going to make can spring from that, and you can begin to redesign what you're looking at, leave things out, add things, edit at will, not feel so locked into a reference photo. I certainly hope not. Or even when painting plein air. I think as a painter you should have, you should feel the liberty to redesign the reality you look at to make a better representation and experience of what it is you see. I talk a lot about the difference between looking and seeing, and what I really mean is we all have our own unique individual experience of what it is we're looking at. And that, I think, is what we try to paint. Rather than slavishly copying what we're looking at, we try to interpret that, paint a perception of that, either in a somewhat realistic manner or much more abstract or impressionistic. In any case, my painting style, I suppose, typically falls somewhere in the middle. It's sort of an interpreted realism, for lack of a better term. But let's get into what I'm seeing today and how I interpret that into a painting. I'm here in New York City. This is a view looking south on First Avenue at 60-something, 63rd Street, I believe. Anyway, I really loved this clash, the contrast between the light here, but also the color yellow and the rest of the painting. I've established what I want to make the center of focus, which will be right about here. Sorry, my voice. Your center of focus in your painting is almost always the place. It doesn't have to be a spot. It can be an area. It can be a whole swath through the painting. But in this particular case, it's going to be a fairly contained area. Here's the sketch I did. Right here. And the way I like to paint, and there certainly is no one right or wrong way to paint, how else do we develop our unique individual styles unless we believe there is no one right way? There is the way that works for you. You can be influenced or taught to skew this way or that, or to pick elements or techniques out from this or that instructor, or that you pick up on your own. But ultimately it's you. You have a unique set of impulses, visual responses to what it is you are looking at. That's what makes you the painter you are, and nobody can paint like you, and you can't paint like anybody else. So all the time we waste comparing ourselves to others, stop it. It is not a good use of our time. Back to the matter at hand. Just to make this simple on myself, I've decided I want to create a focal point. This point at which this awning interacts with the rest of the painting. So I've established a dominant vertical, a dominant horizontal, which in this case is the horizon line. In this case is roughly the edge of the building that shows in the photo. So I'm not copying it, I'm just using it as a useful design compositional tool. Where those two energies cross, horizontal, vertical, essentially that's my center of focus. It's a one-point perspective. I won't go into that in great depth, but that also is where all the visual information in the painting will recede along the horizon line. This is a way I like to paint. I establish my center of focus. This is where generally my most saturated colors are, my darkest values, my lightest values, so therefore my highest area of contrast. My tighter edges, most of the detail, if I have any, is going to fall within this radial center of focus. Details, saturation, values, color, everything radiating out from that point will gradually fade in importance and in actuality to orchestrate the viewer's eye to go right where you want it to go. This is what you have the power to do as a painter. You don't have to go out and find these things. You can create them, you can invent them. You can be inspired, obviously, by what you look at, but as I am in this case. But again, I'm not married to it. These are all just starting points. So what I've done is taken the literal reality of what I'm looking at, and then I've sort of redesigned it into what I hope will be a better or more interesting composition of elements. I'm including this utility pole here off to the left, but I'm going to include it as a dark shape, incorporate it into the dark shape that I'm going to work into this building, the shadows under the awning, etc., all here to establish a foreground. Redesigning the light altogether, I'm going to make a burst of light right behind here, as you can see in the sketch. Grading out everything from that point, keeping all of my darks primarily here, as I say, to establish a foreground. Also in some of the figures I'm going to add into the foreground, and the values become lesser and lesser as we radiate out from that point. As far as color, those of you who follow my work know that I'm primarily a proponent of value design and composition. I love color, it's important. It carries a very emotional component through the work, but I believe it has to be hung on a very strong, well-designed sense of value in order for any color to work. So what I've decided to do is a painting essentially in two colors, two complements, primarily yellows and violets. So I'm going to change most of the colors in the reference to maintaining this yellow. I find this a signifier color, so I'm keeping that. But everything else, for the most part, is going to be a variation on violets and grays, all subservient to the dominant color here. Also, those of you who follow my work know that my way into art, my way into making paintings, is the idea of contrast. Light versus dark, sure, but also solid versus void, vertical versus horizontal, warm tones versus cool, the man-made versus the natural world, the past versus the present, etc., etc. The contrasts I'm using here are light versus dark, verticality versus horizontality, warm tones primarily here, contrasting with cool tones primarily here, and solid, of course, versus void. I love painting cityscapes and architecture, but you know, I've found over the years that no built or human-made object is particularly interesting unless it has, you know, the knowledge that it's only the people that live there or work there or interact with it that give that object that's a building life. And in a visual image, it's really only the contrast between the solidity of a built structure and the negative or the atmospherics, the negative shapes versus the positive shapes that help give both a sort of life and identity. And I find an interesting contrast or collision of ideas within a painting, hopefully finding harmony on the surface. So I worked up this little sketch in my sketchbook using my favorite, these Palomino 602 by Blackwing sketch pencils. The horizontal versus the vertical. I'll be relatively true to the visual information I see in the photo here, but in the background I've decided to swap things up a bit. If you walk one block east over to York and look down, look south, you see in the near distance the outline of the 59th Street Bridge, which is just something I love. So I thought it would enliven the background to subtly drop it in as sort of positive shapes against the negative atmospherics of the sky beyond. So yeah, I'm using an amalgam of buildings, shapes, bridges, etc. to make, I hope, a better, more interesting painting. I'm using some idea of these buildings across First Avenue to form the left side of the painting, but they're very incidental, not that important. This group of people happened to be walking across the street when I took this photo, as you can see, and the little kids here are wearing these yellow safety vests, which is just by chance, but I thought, oh, that's a great opportunity. I can play up this theme of yellow versus violet by amplifying the yellow on the kids' vests, the yellow on the awning naturally, the yellow on these floral vines, and then the yellow that appears in the don't walk signs and in the stoplights up above. So I think I can create an interesting, hopefully interesting patterning of yellows, and also a couple of the cabs that you see driving north up First Avenue here. So anyway, in theory, it should all work. Here's a sketch I did, so you can see where I'm thinking. Yeah, so here you can see a fairly faithful rendition of the building that's actually there. Though this has bricked up windows, I've decided to leave real windows there just for some additional texture and interest. Moved the vanishing point over to just behind the corner here so you don't see around the corner, but this will be the demarcation line. My dominant vertical will be right in that area. Compositionally, the dominant horizontal, of course, is the horizon line. Compositionally, that makes a nice, solid, pretty classical rule of thirds composition. Third of the way up from the bottom is the dominant horizontal energy, and a third of the way in this case, from the right, the dominant vertical. So it all should lay out harmoniously. I've redesigned this utility pole to go right the way up off the page and dropped in some random collection of cross beams, supports, road signs, parking signs, all that street clutter. That can be annoying, but it can also work for you in a painting, and I'm going to try to do that here. Then, knowing I want to work this theme or sub-theme of yellow versus violet throughout the painting, I've put in some stop lights here. They may not be terribly accurate, they're not, but that's okay. I don't paint or draw to be utterly accurate, again, to what I look at, but to be true to what it is I'm trying to tell. This is all relatively accurate in terms of what's there, but I enhanced or enlarged the coverage of the vines just for some texture and additional opportunity for color. Some taxis over here, I can leave out yellow, and again the kids' safety vests. So I'm pretty happy with the overall line drawing composition of elements. It's a little more fully drawn and a little darker than I would normally do if I was just sitting here by myself, but I wanted it to show up well on camera so you could see what I'm doing. And yeah. So also, if any of you have followed my other videos or my courses, you know how strongly I feel about this. Doing a sort of an idea, a compositional sketch before you start your final painting. This took me maybe 10 minutes. You could do one even simpler. But why I do this, it's just cements in my mind where I want the main elements to appear in the painting, but primarily the main values, the lights, the midtones, the darks. Watercolor, I call it a subtractive medium in that we start with 100% of the light and we don't paint the light because the light is already there. What we do is we subtract away the light by adding dark. We paint the shades, we paint the shadows to give life its identity. So in that sense, as a painting medium, it's a bit backward from some others, but I find that's what's both challenging and exciting about it. When it works, it's very beautiful. However, it's a lot easier to save the lights rather than to reclaim them, because once they're painted over or lost, it's pretty hard to reintroduce luminosity back into your painting once the lights have been lost. So this just helps me identify where I want them, which is very different than the reference photos make it seem. There's no real strong direction of light here. It's subtly from the east, but generally it's sort of scattered throughout. Here, I've gathered up the lights primarily into this ball of light, and there are lights throughout the painting, but the dominant area of light is just there, and that's quite different than the reference photo makes it look. So yeah, I've redesigned the lights to suit my evil purposes and hoping that works. That way, I like to tell my classes that if you get your thinking done, so to speak, out of the way first in your sketchbook, you can paint in a much more relaxed atmosphere. You can breathe easier and not stop and think. Thinking is useful, it's helpful, it's good that we can do it, but it can also get in our way. I think if you paint from a much more emotive place without having to stop and think, having the thinking already done for you, you're generally speaking going to do a better job. Turn the page over because I'm painting on a tilted easel. And another thing I think a lot of us tend to forget about or not utilize to its best advantage while painting watercolor is gravity. If you tilt the board this way or that, you can very easily encourage the paint to run in the direction you want it to run, and it makes it a lot easier for you to save areas of white or edges, etc., etc. So I've just wet the paper there with just pure clean water, no color yet. And I'm going to drop in the distance just a little bit of this yellow. I'm using the dominant yellow I'm going to be using today is a cadmium medium, or cadmium deep it's called. It's a bit aggressive, but because yellow is such a big thematic element in my painting, I've decided to go a little bit more bold than I might normally. So I'm establishing here sort of a big graded wash. It's a very traditional, what we used to call a French wash. I don't know if it was developed in the Beaux-Arts, but it was certainly employed by them a great deal. And it's where you establish or build up a little bead of paint and you pull it down the surface of the page in the direction that gravity will flow, so that one tone runs very organically into the next. And you can, with enough pigment and enough water, you can make it an absolutely beautifully smooth, translucent, transparent wash. Very simply. I'm going to tilt this up to give it a little additional gravity. This just enhances the ability for the tones and the values to run together. So I've graded this again from clear water, no color, tiny bit of yellow, using Daniel Smith colors today. So that was cadmium yellow deep. This is a imperial purple, toned down with a little bit of neutral tint and then a little bit additional neutral tint just at the top to subtly set up darkening, all in midtones though, nothing terribly dark yet. The painting surface today is Baohong rough surface, 140 pound or 300 gram paper. It's very heavily textured. It's not right for all paintings, but I think for these kinds of urban scenes, it can be a very useful paper because it's sort of, because of the highly textured surface, can sort of imply a sort of urban grit. And also these big wet washes, the pigments sink into the little valleys, float over the little mountaintops, and you get that beautiful speckled, very translucent effect that you can really only do this beautifully in watercolor. So very simple wash. Of course, I've gone over everything because everything else I'm going to paint will be darker than this. No need to cut around everything and save any additional light. The only light I wanted to save is just there. It's going to be in my center of focus where all the darkest darks and all the lightest lights will be. As far as a brush for that big wet wash, I used one of my signature brushes, Thomas Schaller brushes by Neef, N-E-E-F company. Great company, beautiful brushes. In the description, I'm going to list the paper and all the materials and colors I've used. So the downside of painting upside down like this is I have to wait till this wash sets a bit, till the shine starts to go away before I turn it right side up again. Otherwise, it'll backwash and give me a bunch of blossom lines and streaks that I don't want in this case. I want a very smooth, luminous wash. I'm going to enhance the speed by using a hairdryer, which I don't like to use. I prefer letting things just air dry, but just to save time, I will. So the size of this painting is not very big. It's a quarter sheet, so roughly 12 inches by 15 inches tall. And it's just taped down to a piece of gator board. It's not stretched. I can get into all that later, but I just don't find that necessary. This will dry perfectly flat when it's done. I can turn it right side up again because even though this is not dry, it's dry enough. The shine has gone away so that it's too dry to backwash on itself and create any ugly streaks that we don't want. What else can I tell you? I'll just keep painting. As things occur to me, I'll let you know. I talk and paint a lot in my classes. I can do it. I can't say that I'm great at it, but I feel like I want to try. I want to try always to explain what I'm doing and the decisions I make while I'm making them so that you don't have to guess. Another way to add just pure water without brushing it on is this. I use these little Holbein mist bottles, and I'm just misting there in the area where I want to save my dominant light. I'm doing that because I'm going to do a smaller version of this wash down to anchor the bottom and to help carve the light away to begin to emphasize my center of focus. Same story, a little bit of the yellow, cad yellow, and then the violet neutral tint. So it's the same idea, but a little bit more assertively done because I have less area to work with. And I want to build up a little bit of tone at the very bottom of the painting to anchor it, and again to orchestrate the viewer's eye to ultimately just go right there. Here in this wet wash, I can drop in some slightly darker tones initially just to make things go more smoothly, to imply some reflections in the street, but really just an easy way to add some tone. So that was pretty simple, not much going on. Tilting it up just to give it more gravity to make those tones and colors run together organically. Why I do this with the paper towel is not because I'm so neat, but I built up this bead of pigment and water, as I said, and if I don't siphon it off with a paper towel or something, as it begins to dry, it will leach back up into the wet wash above and give me a really nasty looking streak, which we don't want. Streaks aren't always bad, but in this case, I don't want them. You can also sort of pull the moisture out of a mop style brush or a round brush and then lightly run it across the area where that bead builds up, and that's another way to sort of siphon off that excess water that you don't want. Always I build my paintings up from the lightest light to the darkest dark. So that means I work largely in midtones for 2/3 of the painting. Everything I'm painting now are lighter versions of the mid-tone colors I'm going to use, the mid-tone values. As you can see here, holding pretty true to my little blueprint. I keep this sketch nearby me, and the reference photos, I've just hidden them away. I don't want to look at them because if I do, I'll start even subconsciously copying what I see, and that's not a good thing. I'm fairly done with the reference photos altogether at this point. I'm just interested in only adding what will make my painting better, not what will make it more accurate to the reference photos. And I haven't done my drawing very faithfully to them anyways, so they don't really have a lot to offer me. What I want to do now is just start adding the slightly darker midtones in the background and the more near midground over here. So same tones, violets, just on top of what I already did. Again, it's not 100% dry, but it's dry enough that it can hold an edge slightly. And if it hits areas that are a little bit wet and it melts in, that's really all to the good. If this bridge way in the distance doesn't look too etched or too specific, it actually would be a good thing. I'm using a smallish 1/8 inch flat brush just to hopefully fairly quickly indicate the structure of the bridge in the distance. I don't want to do any kind of accurate rendering of it. I just want it to look barely present, ghost-like almost. It's really just a compositional device to sort of animate this neutral sky in the distance. The last thing I want is to go too detailed or too specific, and definitely not too dark. So the small flat brush is just a good tool to help me be able to lay in some idea of it relatively quickly and with just gesturally, without getting too hung up in trying to do an accurate rendering of it. That wouldn't be good. The flat brush I'm using also because this is a really cheap brush I bought somewhere for next to nothing. Synthetic, which in this case is good because it doesn't hold a lot of water, which allows me to do some of these dry brush marks where you can start a line and it runs out of water quite quickly and leaves all those skip marks on the surface of the rough paper, which isn't always desired, but in this case it is, because it helps imply detail without really showing it and helps it look far away. This is a larger flat brush, same idea, just very quick dry brush marks. So it gets a lot of those skip marks so that the bridge looks slightly less resolved and more far away. You can also use the flat edge of a flat brush to sort of scrape in some idea of the struts, structural elements, that sort of thing. Yeah, I think that'll be okay. You know, always with watercolor, whatever you see first looks so large and dominant, even though in the final analysis, it's not very dark at all. So what I'm doing here is just with this violet gray dry brush marks, I'm just literally scraping in some of the ideas of background buildings behind which this bridge vanishes. Can't even really see what I've drawn, but that's okay. I can just make it up. So yeah, all violets, grays. I'm not using any other colors yet. Larger swipes of this. This is a 1/2 inch flat brush. Again, synthetic, so it runs out of water fairly quickly and allows these kinds of luminous sparkles to sort of appear quite naturally. So really, these buildings across the street are not at all critical to the information of the painting, but they're important mid-tone shapes just to help establish where all the values need to go. So yeah, not too bad. I don't want any detail, any windows, any sort of architectural identities. Not going to help at all. I did turn it right side up, knowing this is still pretty wet. Hopefully that wet will run down, add a little more substance to the tops of these structures, and definitely less so at the bottom. Using the flat side of a flat brush, I'm going to just carve in some connecting lines. These aren't really descriptive, they're just textural, and hopefully will connect the various areas of the painting. Whatever I'm doing here, I'm primarily being conscious to try not to do too much. Definitely it's far away, and we want it to look far away. So the more detail, value, edges, etc. I add to anything way back there, the more it begins to pull forward and call out for attention, and that is not what I want. So, so far so good. That looks fine. Everything looks in the background as it should. This building face is one of the darkest. However, this is the center of focus where the darkest darks and lightest lights will occur. So while this face of the building is more forward and wants to be in this composition darker, I don't want the top of it to be overly saturated and pull the viewer's eye up off the page too much. So just counseling myself to make it dark, but save all the real darks for this area. I'm going with this very restricted color theme, and yeah, I'm not 100% sure it's going to work as well as I hope it will, but I've made a plan and I'm going to stick to it. So now I'm swapping out for another flat brush. This is an Escoda Versatile Series 3/4 inch. This is the same color mix, the Imperial Purple with a bit of neutral tint mixed in, but more saturated, so therefore less water, more pigment. Same general approach to painting though. This flat brush makes these architectural shapes and edges definitely are easier to suggest, but I don't want them too architectural, so mess them up there on purpose with a little bit of dry brush. But as information down here becomes more important, I'm going to allow myself to get a little tighter and a little bit more specific. So here I'm swapping out to the smaller flat so I can get a little tighter where the painting demands. So as I get down here closer, I'm using progressively less water, more pigment. So that the edges will be crisper, the values will be more defined. And so far so good, I think. Again, this is just a theory I have that this very restricted color theme is going to work well, but I think it will if I stick to it and don't interrupt it with any other colors and just keep it purposefully very restricted. I think it could be a pretty interesting painting when it's all done. So here I'm just using the flat edge of the brush to drop in little bits of deeper tone with less water, just to subtly add more value, interest, etc. as we get down here closer and closer and closer to the focal point. Sorry, I lost my voice last week. I mean, literally it was gone, which was kind of a mercy for some people, but yeah, it's hard to talk. I thought it was back, but not quite. Here, I don't want to lose all those sparkles. I like them, but I think maybe enough is enough. Okay. Here what I'm trying to do is decide how I want to treat this window that really isn't there. I just made it up. I think I'll probably want to maintain some light, but probably not nearly as much as I have shown right now. So this is the small flat brush again with just out of the tube neutral tint. Almost no water. For some pretty dark value, obviously. I think that's okay for now. You can always add tones later to your white areas, but it's hard to get them back once they're lost. So if you're not sure how much to get rid of, probably best to save them as much as you can, because they may prove useful later. I will do some dry brush character marks on this wall to give it a little forward identity as it dries, but it's not just yet. That'll all be after the fact, after it's really dry. I'm just trying to work with this dark wash now to drop in wet, enough value to add character to the bottom of this. This is a very dark black signage band, I think, on the building. Now, again, I don't need to be accurate or faithful to that, but I want to be, in this case, because I think the dark band will be very useful to get this bright yellow band to jump out. So here I'm using, again, the flat small brush, almost no water, and I'm using a color that I just never use, actual black pigment. Fairly opaque, a little bit of water, of course, to get it to flow, but it's generally almost out of the tube. Proceed with caution if you ever use actual black paint. It's very easy to achieve a black color by mixing complements, but I just want to get there quick, so I'm using out of the tube black paint. The problem with actual black pigment is that it tends to dry very flat and chalky. So I think in small areas you can get away with it, but in large areas it can look very lifeless. Yeah, but that's okay. I'm happy enough with that. It's working. I've introduced some of my darkest darks a little sooner than I might normally do, but that is because it was just part of this larger wash. And while it was still wet, it was easier to do that now than later. I'll go back to slightly lighter washes here and try to flesh out the midground and whatever we see in the distance. I don't think anything else is needed informationally on these buildings or bridge in the background. They all look fine to me, and over the top is going to be layered this dark utility pole, signs, wires, all sorts of junk. So I think I want to keep them just as a neutral shape to sort of fall away into the background. So I'm happy enough with all that. Okay. It's all very clever to redesign the world, but yeah, I have no reference photo because I just made all this stuff up. My series of Neef brushes, the shameless plug Thomas Schaller Master Artist Neef brushes, are great, but they come from in a very large mop size, number 8, I believe, down to very small. This is like a 00 or 000, but they're still a mop, so which means they have long pointed bristles. They hold a moderate to large amount of water, but they're great in the small size because they act almost like riggers or very small pointed rounds, except they're a little larger, and again, they hold a little bit more water. So I find them a very, very useful brush. Good for doing this kind of detail. I've worked in some additional power lines, etc., across the road, which I'm dropping in now, but I'm trying to be cautious not to go too dark because I definitely want them to look far away. This is one of the traffic lights that is there, kind of. I've moved it around or repositioned it. It's in the distance, so I want it yellow, but I don't want it to be too intensely yellow, so I'm dropping a little violet in. I'm going to save all of my intense yellows for that awning in that area. Same here, little hints of yellow, but I'm dropping violet into them to neutralize them a bit and make them look further away and less dominant. I've envisioned some humans across the street. Not all that critical as far as compositional elements, but I want them there just to provide texture and scale and scope to make this avenue look, to help make this avenue look as wide and as expansive as it really is, and also just to add some scale to the painting and texture. A few little marks in this violet should do it. Don't need to get too fancy. I think these cluster of vehicles is the next thing to paint. Cars. You can go so wrong painting cars in watercolor. Well, actually anything like that. You can be painting along very fluidly and loose, and then you run up against a vehicle or a boat, a car, a person, a tree, anything very specific that has a lot of little parts. And the tendency can be to just become tight and rigid and overly specific. That is my tendency as well, so I'm fighting that, trying to keep them, you know, they're not the star of the show by any means, but they're compositionally somewhat important, but they're definitely not the focal point. So I want to keep them loose, fluid, sketchy, and gestural. I really do want a couple of these, though, to be yellow, traditional yellow cabs, which in New York you see fewer and fewer of now with Lyfts and Ubers, etc., but they're still there. And for this painting, they'll just add a nice potential for me to add some additional violet, yellow dialogue patterning throughout the whole painting. Speaking of New York, you can probably hear the ubiquitous sirens outdoors. Ah yes, urban living. So again, this is secondary compositionally in the whole painting, but this sort of violet yellow texture reading through on the in the midground here is important. So I'm trying to keep it spatially where it belongs in the distance, but just to enliven this part of the painting a bit behind what I know is going to be the darker, more specific elements. That'll be the awning, the foreground, people, the vine, etc. Maybe not 100% there, but generally I think that's probably good enough for now. I can always go back and add bits of specificity if I think it needs it later, but it may not. So generally better to quit a little before you think you're 100% done. Okay, I think the thing to do now is most of the midtones are established, not 100%, but most of them are. It's now time to begin thinking about the foreground elements, this large utility pole, the signage, fleshing out and finishing up this, and then finally our focal point. Next thing I think would be to begin working on this foreground signage pole here that I did take from the reference photos, but I also re-envisioned quite a lot. Really, it's a compositional element, so I want it to feel in the foreground, carrying kind of a jumble of dark shapes to pull forward of all the buildings, etc. beyond. So I'm using this very dark neutral tint, bits of violet, but largely out of the tube neutral tint. This is walk, don't walk signs, and point of fact, they're really deep yellow, and I want to include some yellow there, but I also think they'll probably need a little violet to make compositional sense. So I'm trying to work this up all together, wet and wet, to keep everything connected so everything doesn't look like it's painted in pieces or stuck on. It's not all wet and wet, it's wet on dry, but I'm trying to run one wet area into another so that all this jumble of information looks connected. Come right down to the ground. I want to connect this base of this post to a shadow. And I need to do that before it dries completely, but I also want to finish off the aerial part. So I'm going to try to just paint quickly and connect everything. dropping some of the gray violet into the yellow just to connect all those shapes. And then a little bit more brighter yellow into that. So it's kind of unky and neutral, but I think that's okay. Can't entirely see what I've drawn here, so it's okay. I think I can afford to be a little abstract about it all. It's very liberating to invent all of this, but it's it's also a very seat of the pants painting. I don't really know what's there, so I'm just adding what I think makes the painting better and not worrying about what it actually looks like or if it really makes that much sense. I trust that in the end, it kind of will. I'm adding in some sense of wires and connectors just to kind of intentionally junk it up to add texture and busyness. It's quite wet, so I'm dropping in little bits of really undiluted violet into some of these very wet areas. I hope so that it looks less gray and sings off the yellows. Cad yellow is very beautiful by itself, but I'm reminded why I don't use it often. It doesn't mix too well with other colors. I think it has a bit of opacity to it, so it tends to look a little flat when it mixes, but I think it'll be fine. This whole painting is intended to be a little bit more graphic, certainly not as pictorial or scenic as some things I try to do. Good, generally. I think that's fine. I'm just assessing this as I'm going to see if I need to add any additional connectors or visual information. I don't know that I need to, but I think I will. Oh, right. At the very bottom, I wanted to connect the bottom, as I said, with its shadow so that it doesn't, you know, look like it's floating in space. So I wanted to do that before it dried. It got a little bit dry, but I can re-wet it. One of the worst things for me in a watercolor is when various elements of the painting do not look connected. It looks like one area was painted, allowed to dry, and then the next area, and everything looks kind of paint by number. Just do not like that look. I like everything fluid, connecting up, joining together, looking like it was intended. Fine, but I think I'm going to add a little bit of this dry brush down. This is a technique that can be overdone, I admit, and look a little trite, but I think it is a very effective way of connecting elements of the painting. So I think it's valid. A little might go a long way, but I think you can do it. If it were raining, it makes a lot more sense to do this, but even on dry pavement, you will see some of these visual reflections. But again, it's such a great way to connect various elements of the painting. Okay, so while I've been doing all that, this building has become nearly dry, not 100%, but pretty close. So I can put whatever character marks on this I think it really needs. This window, of course, is far closer to the center of focus, so it can handle a little bit more value, a little bit more saturated tones. As we go up the face of the building, fewer and fewer marks are needed, less saturated values, etc. Not trying to be very descriptive or accurate about these marks, just trying to add texture and hopefully a sense of believability to this facade. One thing I might do is in this very lower window put a little bit of the yellow tone to visually connect it to everything. Don't want to go overboard, so just a hint of it I think will help. Yeah, I think that'll do. I honestly don't remember if this building is brick or what it is, so it doesn't matter. I'm going to just use this mid-size flat and do some dry brush character marks on it as if it's brick. Really, this is just to add texture and to orchestrate the viewer's eye to come down into the painting and center here. So again, less of this kind of stuff as we go up, more of it down here. Very typical for New York. There's a spider web of fire escapes on the far side of the building here, which, yeah, I could edit out and leave out, but I think it's going to be not necessary, but I think useful to help orchestrate, again, the viewer's eye to follow down and go to the center of focus, to add some texture and sense of believability to this facade. Key here is to add enough without going overboard and doing too much. Using a combination of the small mop and the little 1/8" flat, just to carve in some light and shapes here. Trying very hard to fade the information out as it crawls up to the top of the painting to keep the dominant interest down here lower. So far, I don't know, so far so good, I guess. Yeah, that'll do. Okay, so at this point, I think generally it's working. I think you can see that I'm pretty successful in keeping the darker tones, but really where I'm going is to keep a higher level of contrast here, a little bit less everywhere else. Generally, that's working pretty well. So yay me. But not done yet, that's for sure. And I am really fighting this restrictive color palette that I've decided to do. I still think it's a good idea, but it's not something I do all the time, so it's I'm a little bit out of my depth, but it's always good to try new things and see what happens. Okay, now I think it's probably time to put in the primary yellow of the awning. And then while that's wet, some sense of this vining that's crawling around on it. Still, while that's wet, I expect I will try to establish the shadowy areas of the storefront below the awning. And then when that starts to set, I'll put in the people, and then we are essentially done. So I want to choose the right brush for this awning. I'm going to just use a round, I think, or one of these mid-size mops. Holds a moderate amount of water, and I don't think there's any real advantage in using a square brush. I just want to be fairly I want to hold an edge is what I'm saying. I don't want to be too general. I want to be a little bit more specific here for once. And have a fairly saturated field of this cadmium yellow deep. Definitely not 100% certain how I'm going to treat this vine. I want it to look on and over the awning, but I don't want it to look pasted on, so I'm going to want to paint the vine on while this yellow field is fairly wet so that it all bleeds together and connects without losing its identity, I hope. Should be possible. That sure is yellow. Okay, so for the vine, I'm going to use tones of a Daniel Smith Permanent Orange. Probably when wet, I'll drop in a little bit of Mayan Orange or Cad Red Light, even something pretty bright, but just as little, just as jewel tones. So I'm using a smaller mop just on its side to try to scruff in this vine and not be too picky or specific about it. Leaving here and there little bits of the white paper showing through just to add little senses of sparkle or light. This bright orange yellow vine was such a shock. I photographed this just the other day. We're in March, the weather's getting nicer, but it's still definitely winter. To be fair, I didn't honestly check to see if this vine was real or not. I'm pretty sure it's not. So fairly carelessly daubing this in to make it look as rough-hewn and unkempt as possible. Another contrast against all the more architectural shapes and harder edges. So that's just a permanent orange. Does have a little bit of cad red that leached into it. Generally okay. While that's still relatively wet, I'll use a small mop and just drop in some additional yellow. As if blossoms, real or fake, whatever they may be. Okay. Around the corner below the awning, some of this vine shows, but it's in shadow. So while that's still a bit wet, I'm going to drop in with the small mop a little bit of violet to darken it and shadow it out as it turns around the corner. Here and there a few violet tones to, I don't know, imply shadows against the awning itself. Give it just another layer, dimension of texture. Doesn't need much. I don't want to overdo this, but just a little. Okay, I think that will do. Now, before this dries completely, I want to start to drop in some really deep tones under. There's a glass storefront to a restaurant under this deep awning vine combination. And tonally, in reality, it was quite dark, but I think regardless of that, for the painting, it wants to be pretty dark to help pop out the lights here. And I think it wants to be dark, purpley violet to help complement the yellows and oranges up above. So with just a little water, I'm fairly carefully brushing in this imperial purple with a little bit of neutral tint mixed in. Not looking at a reference photo, so I can sort of design the shadow however I want. Just whatever looks best in the painting, which is my advice, what you should always do. If you see a shadow or a light condition or anything in reality, you should not feel obligated to draw or paint it that way. You should feel you have the right, because you do, to change it to whatever works best for your painting. But some would ask me, how do you know what's best for your painting? Well, I think you do. You certainly know what doesn't work when you do it wrong. So that's been my way over the years. Do it wrong enough times, eventually you figure out, okay, don't do that anymore. Next time, do it right. I know, it isn't that simple. I still do everything wrong all the time. I'm not 100% sure this is going to be right when it's finished, but I sort of like the idea of this painting still, so we'll see. So far, so good. I'm trying to go really dark with this wash under, but still keep it in the violet family to set up that electricity between the yellow and the violet complement. Generally, it's working, I think. I'm a little unsure if I want to bring that dark all the way down the storefront glass area to the ground. I believe in the reference photos it probably was all dark, but I know that these figures are going to be standing in front, and some of them are going to be quite dark, so I don't think I want to, I think I want to maintain a little bit of saved white in this glass storefront. Not all of it, obviously, but a little bit of it. Just designing on the fly. Okay, pretty good. It's definitely set up a center of focus as I'd hoped. So we have light and dark in terms of value, bright in terms of color, harder edges, more saturation, etc. Everything else around that area is nicely less, I don't want to say less important, but less emphasized, less focal. A little bit too much super bright yellow reading off this edge of the paper, I think. But that's an easy thing to deal with when it dries. I can just dry brush some violet over it. That'll tone it down just a little. The figures now. Generally speaking, this is still just a sketch-based kind of painting. So what I mean by that is that almost everything within your painting, well, everything within your painting should look like it belongs within your painting. So if you're painting in an overall intentionally sketch-based style, then everything you paint should, with a few exceptions perhaps, be also in that style. So it looks awkward to me when I see really nice fluid sketch-based paintings that then suddenly include a really highly rendered car or tree or a figure. They look out of place. I think you can do a painting, as I'm trying to do here, that has some area that's fairly tightly detailed and the rest of it's very loose. But generally speaking, everything in your painting should be approached and treated in the same stylistic manner so that nothing looks like it wandered in from another painting someplace. So to that end, I'm trying to do the people. I think this is a somewhat tighter, more finished looking sketch than I sometimes do, but it is still a sketch, so I want all the people within it to not look overly tight, overly specific, but to be a little bit more fluid, a little more gestural, a little less specific. So I'm doing these figures in they're not really in the distance, they're in the midground, all kind of in ranges of one color within the violet gray family. As I get into the more foreground figures, I'm definitely going to be dropping in more color to them, especially on the yellow vest. But for these people, I'm sure they're lovely people in reality, even though I made them up. But they're just not that important to this painting. Again, just trying to blend things in, bleed together. Everything looks connected and not pasted on. Here and there I'm leaving little light sparkles as of light, but it's not that planned. It's just sort of happening, and I'm deciding on the fly whether it looks good or distracting. And hopefully I choose correctly. I love painting figures, but yeah, you can just go crazy and get way too detailed, and sometimes that's warranted or even necessary, and other times it really just isn't. Okay, this woman has 3 kids she's walking with. They're the most foreground of my figures. These are the most distant. These are the second most distant. There is a figure here walking a child who is somewhere in between. So I will give her and the child a little bit more attention. But I don't think I want to drop any color onto them. I want to keep them still in the violet family, violet gray. But I'm being a little bit more careful with the sense of light reflections and implication of detail. There's no real detail, but just implying some. Tonally, I'd like her to belong a bit to this storefront shadow beyond. So I'm just going to bleed that in intentionally so it all hopefully joins up together. So yeah, I do have a plan for this drawing, as you know, but I left a lot of room for improvisation, which is what I'm doing. I'm winging a lot of this, just trying my best to listen to the painting and pay attention to what it's telling me it needs and it doesn't need, and what makes sense and what doesn't. That's great, and sometimes that works perfectly, and other times not so much, but I think so far so good. Yeah, all of these pattern of figures need to belong to a value family that's a bit darker, obviously, than anything behind it. Not as dark as what's going to be in front of it. But yeah, everything has a value place. I could see a little bit more value on this character. But I want to try to get them set so I don't have to revisit them later. Just so you know, I'm looking at this painting with, I don't know how to describe it, sort of abstract design eyes, just looking at patterns of light and dark to see what is needed and what isn't. I'm fairly happy with how the patterning is so far. I think a little more texture is needed on this side. I could see dropping in another figure perhaps, but definitely some tonalities coming up from the bottom will help connect all of that. Not sure another figure is really necessary. I kind of like this composition of distant, middle, foreground elements reading through on that axis. So I could do that. I'm going to wait and see if I really think it's needed. Now, if there is a central figure in the painting, it is this woman. So this is a neutral tint out of the tube for her hair, just getting it quickly as dark as I can. I'm really a bit tempted to drop some warmer tonalities onto her coat, but I will confess to you privately, I'm not sure that's a smart thing to do. But something tells me it might be, so I think I will do that. The kids, again, will have yellow vests, but I think a little bit of warm tone on her coat, at least the top part of it, might really make sense in this painting overall. Or it could be a huge mistake. I guess we'll see. It's just a painting. So yeah, I think it was okay. I don't want to bring this color all the way down and make too much of a focal thing out of it. I just thought right in this area, a little bit more of that warm tone would make sense, and I think it did. But now I'm going to toggle back to the violets and neutrals. And as her figure comes down into the page, I'll neutralize those warmer tones and make it more graphic, simpler. Trying to connect her left and right to each child, to each side of her that she's guarding so carefully. I'm not keen on how the figure resolved on the page, so I'm just going to brush up from the bottom with this flat brush just to connect those shapes and keep it more abstract and more graphic, less specific. Okay, okay. This little guy, yeah, this idea of very restricted color is interesting, but it gives you fewer options, and you got to make sure you use them properly. He definitely has a yellow vest, which is all part of my color scheme. But again, just like the woman's coat, I don't think you want that yellow vest to be too specific or to go all the way down, but primarily to read brighter yellow up in this area nearer the top. And then as it goes down, you can fade it out into more neutral tones. Or I can, that's what I'm doing. While that's wet, I'll just wash some of this violet gray up into it, let it run. Yeah, that cadmium doesn't allow mixing too well. It stops the other colors from connecting, so I'm urging it along a little with the brush. But that's not bad. I just wanted that little glint of yellow there, and that's working. Same thing with the bottom of the figure. I don't want it to be too specific, but just to bleed into the bottom of the page. Remember a while ago I did that graded wash over the bottom to sort of anchor the painting, and it worked, but I think it wasn't quite strong enough. So what I'm going to do now is some dry brush painting up from the bottom to add both texture and a little value to the bottom of the painting overall, and to keep the lower portions of these figures looking a little bit more ambiguous, as if they're dropping away into a shadow and illuminating this area a little more. I think while I'm at it, I'm going to add a little bit of that texture here. To knock back a little of that super bright yellow as it goes across the page. Okay, this poor woman is saddled with 3 children. That's a lot of energy. So I will paint them much like I did the little guy to the right side. Somewhat specific, but not terribly so. Just enough so that I can work a little of that bright yellow into the top. Again, just fading the bottoms of the figures more into the neutral gray-violet tonalities. And just keeping that little shock of yellow right at the tops of the figures. Again, I don't want the bottoms of these figures too specific. I want them to fade away a bit into the shadows. I'll use the slightly larger flat Escoda brush, flat brush, to just dry brush some texture up from the bottom. Again, what this helps do is add value along the bottom of the painting, and really highlights that light that I've maintained in there. And I'm going to continue this along throughout. This rough surface Baohong paper is tricky in some ways, but it's really fantastic for dry brush applications. And generally speaking, there it is. I do not think I need to add another figure here. I think I'd like the openness and the air, the light here, carrying through there. It has a nice patterning of light, dark, reading straight through. Little highlights I imagine I could put on these figures when they dry. The dry brush marks, little identity probably. Definitely her, and probably these kids as well. Just to pull them forward a little bit, I can allow myself to get a little bit more specific with them, but they don't need a lot. But overall, I think I held pretty true to my plan as far as organization of values, shapes, and colors. A little bit of improvisation happening, but it all worked together. And just for fun, I can compare it to one of the reference photos. Yeah, you can see it's very different, and yet it is related. It does seem to be true to my attempt to interpret what I look at rather than just copy it. So overall, as a little urban sketch, I'm pretty happy with this. Again, I will post it once I clean up some edges and finish up whatever little details is left. But for now, everybody, thanks so much. Thanks for your time and attention. And I hope this proved entertaining and maybe even a little helpful. But thanks so much, and I'll see you all again soon.